This study is about the impact of AI on the replayability of interactive digital narratives. The main aim is to investigate whether giving players power over the story progression in games enhances their experience in terms of enjoyment and replayability. Most commercial story-driven games are known as decision-based games. These give the players a number of choices which are pre-scripted and thus only give the illusion of choice, as most of the content is recycled and most of these choices don't actually have a lasting impact on the narrative of the game itself. The emergence of interactive digital narratives are traditionally conveyed as branching narratives, such as the aforementioned decision-based game, although recently AI is looked at as a possible implementation to generate story and narrative in real time, mimicking the game master in the traditional tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. This leads to the research question of this project, which is, to what extent does provision of story agency in games increase a player's enjoyment and replayability? This research question led to two hypotheses, which are interactive digital narratives providing story agency foster replayability, and replayability and enjoyment of interactive digital narratives is affected by the perceived story agency. The three main areas looked at in order to conduct the study are narrative, which is the area of interest being investigated, procedural storytelling, which is looked at as a tool to convey these types of narratives, and user experience, which is looked at as a success measure of these types of experiences. Within narratives, we look at traditional narratives, which are the main traditional techniques used within most media, such as film and even games, with one of the most common techniques being Campbell's hero's journey. Then we look at narrative in games, where we have games of progression, which are the games with a linear traditional narrative, and how they make use of gameplay and cutscenes, which most games have gameplay followed by a cutscene, followed by gameplay, and this can feel quite disjointed, and thus there's this conflict between narrative and gameplay. We also look at interactive narratives in different media, such as choose your own adventure books, interactive theatre, the recently released Black Mirror Bandersnatch, and it's important to make note of how these other medias convey this type of experience and narrative and see what can be used for games. Then we look at interactive narratives in digital games, which consists of those with narrative choices, such as Telltale games and the previously mentioned decision-based games. We also have games of emergence, which are the types of games with no set story or goal, but allow the players to forge their own narrative and story, such as the popular game Minecraft. And we see that narrative and gameplay here are more hand in hand, as they allow the player an added level of agency. The next area is procedural storytelling, which can make use of intelligent agents, such as in the game Facade, where an intelligent model reacts on user input and outputs a given pre-recorded reaction. There is also procedural content generation, which can be used to generate a multitude of assets and elements within a game. Although specifically in storytelling, we see a game such as Simon, which makes use of puzzle patterns, which are pre-scripted, and generates content that fits into those types of puzzle patterns. Finally, we have user experience, which is the performance measure of these types of experiences. And specifically, we look at user experience within games and replayability, as if a game is replayable, it will likely be enjoyable. The main motivation for use of AI in interactive digital narratives is the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons, which, despite coming out close to 50 years ago, is still highly replayable by people today. And this all depends on a game master, which is a human who is in charge of controlling the trajectory of the story by reacting to the player's character's actions within the boundaries of the game rules of that world. This provides a unique tailored experience with every playthrough, as it's constantly changing based upon the player's actions. However, it becomes much more complex to digitize a game master, the most viable options being procedural storytelling and artificial intelligence. The experiment conducted within the study gathers user experience of AI-driven intelligent storytelling, which makes use of AI to affect the game as it's happening by reacting to user input and gives some form of feedback based upon that input. The platform, so to speak, is based upon an indie game released late last year named AI Dungeon 2, which is a text-based game utilizing a text generation AI model by OpenAI based on any given input. This game operates by the use of quest patterns, which sets rules using grammars and is used as a foundation to start the generation of the story in the beginning, and is also based upon specific genres, for example, apocalypse, fantasy, mystery, etc. The text-based adventure game in itself is simple and basic in terms of interface and gives more attention to the storytelling element and does not require the extra generation of visuals and audio. To conduct this experiment, I added quest patterns, which are contemporary dreamlike scenarios. This makes use of a mix of real and fictional places and goals, and this dreamlike scenario helps justify the sometimes unpredictable generation of text by the AI. The experiment gathered a total of 23 participants and made use of Google Collaboratory, which uses Google's GPUs rather than requiring the user's own machine, as the AI is quite GPU intensive. And it also allows the game to be hosted without the need to actually download it on your personal device. To run, the participants had to click on the download block, then followed by an installation block, and finally a playing block, which leads you to the game. The game was followed by a post-test questionnaire, which gathered user demographics, prior digital game experiences, prior interactive fiction experiences, factors that might affect the replayability of a digital game, and the review of the game implemented itself. Upon conducting a pilot test, questions were added to assess the game's limitations, such as the basic user interface of the text-based game, and also the feedback delay of the text generation, as it was sometimes slow. This led to an additional hypothesis, which tests the impacts of the game's limitations on the overall results. The results for the first hypothesis, that IDNs providing story agency foster replayability, resulted that players did find the game to be replayable, as it resulted in a median of 4 out of 5 in terms of replayability rating. There was no bias from participants due to prior experience with digital games. A chi-square test suggested that replayability is independent from their previous experiences, and it was also replayable on its own accord. There was low to no correlation between reasons participants find games replayable and the rating that they gave the Storyland game. These results support the first hypothesis that IDNs providing story agency foster replayability. The second hypothesis, being that replayability and enjoyment of IDNs is affected by the perceived agency, resulted in players who perceived the story agency enjoyed it. There were comparisons between agency and enjoyment felt, and there were no participants who felt the story agency and had a negative impact on their enjoyment. There was no, however, detected positive impact on the perceived agency on replayability, as a chi-square test concluded that players' replayability rating of the Storyland game was actually independent from the agency felt. These results do not support the second hypothesis. the final post-pilot hypothesis, which is that the limitations in the storyland implementation have a negative impact on the replayability, took into account the basic text-based user interface and the user interface of Google Collaboratory, the coherence of the overall story generation, and the time taken to generate story when given an input. A correlation test resulted in negative weak correlation with user interface, low to no correlation with the time spent waiting between the player input and the generation, and moderate correlation with the coherence of the overall story. These results suggest that there was somewhat of an effect of the limitations on the experience, although they were not enough to hinder the overall experience of the participants, as shown in the results of H1. Limitations of this experiment is that the AI needed to generate these prompts uses a lot of processing power, which led to the use of Google Collaboratory to run and test, and might limit access for some players. The study was also carried out on a single AI-driven platform and would have resulted in stronger results if compared to a traditional branching narrative. There was also a low number of respondents in this preliminary study, and this of course impacted the statistical process, as some categories had to be combined in order to conduct the chi-square test, and thus could not be 100% accurate. In terms of future work, it would probably be beneficial to compare story agency by an AI-driven interactive narrative, such as the game implemented, and the narrative agency provided in a traditional branching narrative, such as the decision-based games mentioned previously. Also, a larger set of participants with a broader range of demographics would benefit this experiment and give more accurate results. The investigation of whether other elements had an influence on the game's replayability, such as the demographics, the reading habits, and other things, could also be investigated and see if they had an overall impact on the results. It would also be beneficial if other modes of delivery are explored for such a CPU-intensive AI model. Something that came to light when conducting this experiment is that there is no narrative closure, as there's more favor of story agency, since the player's input is always generating new text and new story. There cannot be a set story closure, which is something that should be investigated as well. Other aspects of user experience, such as immersion, should also be looked at further in the future, and the addition of AI-generated visuals, oral and other UI elements to make the game more engaging, immersive, and overall fun. To conclude, interactive digital narratives that provide story agency do foster replayability. IDN's replayability is not necessarily due to their perceived story agency. Storyland's limitations were not enough to hinder the overall experience that the participant had. This shows that AI in storytelling has a promising future to provide players with story agency and an overall more enjoyable and immersive experience. Thank you for listening.